Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Civic Awareness Series. I'm Chris Corrigan. I'm the Public Engagement Coordinator for the museums here at Cantini Park. I'm so happy to host you guys this evening for this amazing presentation about Latinx topics and issues in our suburbs here. We have two amazing speakers, but of course I do want to give a little shout out to the gentleman who is the reason we are here today, and that's Colonel Robert Rutherford McCormick, who was the president and editor of the Chicago Daily Tribune and founder of WGN. During Colonel McCormick's lifetime, he was extremely passionate about being civically engaged in your community. So of course, a partnership with the League of Women Voters and a program about civic awareness in our community would have been near and dear to his heart. So I'm sure he is just doing somersaults of joy in his grave over the fact that we are hosting this program on his estate here at Cantini in Wheaton. I'm not going to take up too much of your time with my mug. I'm going to actually hand things over to the president of the Wheaton chapter of the League of Women Voters, Judy Beavers, to introduce tonight's speakers. So Judy, if you come on down.
Thanks, Chris. So good evening, everyone. We're looking forward to tonight's presentation. And as Chris had said, it's Latinx and issues in the suburbs. And it's going to be presented, actually a team, Sara Phalen, who's with us tonight, and then Elizabeth Cervantes, who will be speaking a little bit later. And so let me just introduce them. As Sara Phalen is active in West Chicago, serving on the boards of the Mexican Cultural Center DuPage, People Made Visible, Gallery 200 Shop, and the West Chicago Historical Society. Sara was instrumental in bringing the marvelous exhibit, the Hebrides, I know I slaughtered that, sorry. Exhibit to Cantini. And tonight she will be speaking on the rich history and the contributions of Latinx culture. And then joining us by Zoom later this evening will be Elizabeth Cervantes. Elizabeth is co-founder and the director of organizing with the Southwest Suburban Immigrant Project, SSIP, an immigrant rights organization in Chicago's Southwest suburbs. Elizabeth will be speaking on the difficulties and challenges facing those seeking immigration today and how we take action. So I'm going to hand it over to Sara. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. If you can't hear me, please do just raise your hand and I'll speak a little louder in the room and hopefully not yell at everybody then on Zoom. Oops, not that button, right? Always. Okay. So as Judy said, tonight we're talking about Latinx community in DuPage, the historical context through modern contributions and struggles. By trade, I'm a legal historian, so this is going to have quite a bit of history involved in it, but I really do think that's very helpful to set the stage. As we've learned over the last few years, it is so important to look back in history to help us better understand today. And we are going to be using West Chicago as a bit of a test case, but much of what I say applies throughout the suburbs and beyond. So when we look at what we refer to today as Latin America, okay, I was just making sure, I didn't know where I was on my pictures up there. So as we look at Latin America today, if we look at the right side of the screen, you can see the colonial context of what Latin America and how it was settled. And that's very, very important to culture today. And then if you look at the left side of the screen, I hope I have you on the right sides up there, you can see the indigenous populations that still exist today throughout Latin America. You know, that was the rich grounds of many, many different indigenous cultures, of native peoples who had their own customs and trades before the Europeans arrived and shifted quite a bit, but you still have those indigenous populations. So that's why we try not to use Hispanic as an identifying term, even though that is the overarching governmental term as far as census, but that speaks so much to the Spanish colonial heritage, which doesn't speak to everybody, whether that's because people are now English speakers, whether no matter what generation they are living here in the United States, or people may speak an indigenous language still living in Latin America. So we really try to be cognizant of that. And then the overlay of colonial influence, this colorful diagram in the middle speaks to the caste system that the colonial powers brought in that classified people a lot based on socioeconomic standards, but also on indigenous standards. So how much blood of an indigenous person did you have in your body, or African heritage, because there was slavery throughout Latin America as well. There's a lot of different factors that overlay the cultures and the people who come from Latin America. When we think about Mexico specifically, I love to start with this map because very few people remember the fact that over half of the United States used to belong to Mexico. So many people that we consider Mexican American in the United States today, their families never crossed the border crossed them. And that's a very important thing for us to remember. Again, remembering that colonial layers upon layers upon layers in some parts of the Americas. We look at the independence of the United States of, so this is when Mexico gets its independence, which its real name is actually the Independent States of Mexico, just like we have the United States of America. And that we really look at these shifting boundaries and what that means for families who came from the areas of Texas and the Southwest, and how their experiences may be very different from even second or third generations who did actually cross the border and come up to this part of North America. We also look at the various independent movements throughout Latin America. And here you see a whole bunch of dates in the early 1800s of when different Latin American countries got their independence. This is really important because it speaks to, first of all, why in the world is Hispanic Heritage Month September 15th through October 15th? Why do we not get a proper month? Well, a lot of this is because many of our Independence Days are around those 2 dates, which is why that's an odd shift. But you see all of these movements really are around the same time. And that's when the independence movements spread throughout Latin America. If we think about independence here in the United States, though, we think of it as a clean cut, and then we controlled our own governments, we the people. That was not the same throughout Latin America. The same systems were not always installed, although some countries do have them. But here I have a little graph that also shows the top 10 countries with environmental conflicts in Latin America. And this is within the last 20 years to show that although you had these independence movements, there was still constant conflict going on, whether it was resource driven, whether it was for other political reasons, whether that caste system that was overlaid on a people of diverse heritage, there's still a lot of struggles that exist. And a lot of that is in the roots of why people choose to continue the journey north and to come and immigrate to the United States and beyond today. When we look at that immigration story, this is a great graph, and I know it's a little bit small, especially for those of you here in the room, but it breaks down by the national background, so by the country of origin. When you get closer into the graph, you can see the large numbers. And of course, this odd tealish color, maybe we would call it. This is from Mexico, so you can see the exponential growth of how many more Mexican immigrants we have in the United States versus the other countries. But you can see that huge growth at about the 1960s and 70s. And when we talk about our case study, we're going to see that that bears out as well. There's a lot of reasons for that and why we see this exponential growth in the whole United States, but this is also reflected here in the suburbs and in Illinois. Our context here in the county. So although, especially from the Mexican Cultural Center, we like to tell the story that we have had Mexican immigration to specifically West Chicago, but as well as in Aurora for over 100 years. Mexican immigration is not a new phenomenon. This is something that's been happening. We do see a large growth from 1980s to 2010 by almost 700%. And you can see this here just in our DuPage County Latinx growth. 1990s equated to 5% of the population, and then that large jump in our most recent census up to 15%. So that's quite a big jump. There's many people who have studied this, and there's a really interesting researcher, John Koval, who has termed suburban Chicago the Latino capital of the Midwest. And although many people align our Latino immigrant population to Chicago, there's a huge push out into the suburbs. for the many reasons that other people have left the suburbs, or left Chicago for the suburbs, many Latinx people have as well. The economic opportunities, there's a lot of industrial growth, a lot of jobs, a lot of entrepreneurial opportunities to open your own businesses out here in the suburbs at less cost, just like other populations that leave the city, and social opportunities. Not everybody wants to live in an apartment their entire life, and if you have more opportunities out here. So the same reasons that other populations leave Chicago for the suburbs is what we're seeing mimicked in the Latinx population as well. We also, these are some numbers for the Aurora, Elgin, and West Chicago, which in the western suburbs, we see some of the highest percentages of Latinx population. And when we look at those raw numbers of just population, we also look at the school district numbers. In Aurora, 87% of the school district are Latinx students. Elgin's 51%, and in West Chicago, 80%. So we're not just looking at a majority minority population in these communities, but the school districts. And how is that reflected in teaching, social workers within the teachers, other resources? If your population of your students is that high, but it's not nearly reflected in the staff of these institutions, how do we also get imbalances in that way? So it's also something to remember to think about when people say, oh, well, we're only 15% of DuPage County. School age is way, way higher. And also an interesting stat from the last census that 19.2% of DuPage County's population was born outside of the United States. So just our immigrant population overall is also really growing. When we look at the state context, there's a lot more statistics, which are really wonderful, that talk about the growth, which we see in income as well. So as our numbers are going up, we're also finding ground and more foundation in economics, and also in the labor force, which I think we all hear so much about. As we look at West Chicago as a little bit of a case study, we had 3 major waves that align to what we see nationally as well. So in 1910, Mexico has a Mexican Revolution, which, just like we see with the war in Ukraine today, pushes people out. It's a push factor. And we get a lot of people who come up all the way up to the suburbs for jobs. And then in the late 1940s and 50s, we get some overflow from the Bracero program, which was actually a federal program during World War II to bring in workers to replace the United States men who were off fighting. But we continue to see a large push after that. And then if we remember that big chart, in the 60s and 70s, we see a spike, and that is reflected in our local population as well. So to go a little bit more in depth in the 1910s and all the way up to the 30s, the Mexican Revolution is pushing people out, and there's a lot of industry being built up north, including the railroads. In West Chicago, we have 3 local families that documented their time in boxcar camps on the west side of town. Aurora also had boxcar camps, and there were some in Blue Island. And we have wonderful documentation of this due to a lot of researchers. These pictures show our Zarate family, our Pineda family, and our Bonastro family that you can see pictured here. And these are actually reflected. When we look at the 1910 census for our boxcar camp, we see a smattering of Mexican families. By the 1920s, it's almost all Mexican workers living in the boxcar camp. These families also integrated themselves into the community as best they could. They attended West Chicago schools, although they lived in a boxcar camp on the west side of town. And then most importantly, by the time the kids grew up and World War II broke out, they went and served overseas, despite the fact that some of them were not citizens, which are similar things we see today with some of our immigrant populations who do go off or do enlist in the military. In our second wave, in West Chicago, we see a really unique characteristic because this is pictures of Campbell's Soup Mushroom Farm. And if anybody was here in the western suburbs, even into the 1980s, Campbell's Soup Mushroom Farm was still operating. It was the longest operating company town in the state of Illinois. So they originally hired in 1947, Campbell's figured out how to freeze dry mushrooms and put them into soup. And they opened up 8 different mushroom farms throughout the United States, 2 of them here in Illinois. And this one was quite large. And they originally had Puerto Rican workers. but Puerto Ricans are citizens. And at a point, they had to be paid minimum wage, which meant Campbell's Soup got rid of their Puerto Rican workers and brought in Mexican workers because they didn't have to pay them minimum wage. They lived in housing on site. If anybody knows where Wheaton Academy is today, that was right where their housing was. And they worked in these mushroom barns. You can see a picture of the interior of the mushroom barn. And so mushrooms need dark warmth, which we don't have all year long here in Illinois. So they actually had electrical cords that ran through the mushroom barns. It was a recruitment of workers. So they were given an opportunity, given pay, given housing, which to somebody fleeing Mexico or looking for a better opportunity might have seemed like a great opportunity. And it did get them up north. But there were a lot of issues. In 1962, one of the workers in that mushroom barn was electrocuted and died. And that led to actually a national strike. At that time in the late 50s and 60s, there's a whole lot of stuff going on out in California with the grape strikes. So our strike here in Illinois didn't get as much of attention as it did out there, but there were picketers. There was a national boycott of Campbell's Soup that lasted 2 days, which was pretty impressive in that time. And that all originated from organizing that was done in West Chicago. Much like we see a lot of immigrant groups find refuge in churches and find assistance, social service assistance, these workers did as well. And the churches that were related to Mary and Joy, the priests and the nuns actually came out to West Chicago and helped the workers. This was a long fight until the 1970s when the housing was declared an actual company town. And it was exactly what you've heard of in the days of the Industrial Revolution, where they would go to the company grocery, money was taken out of their paycheck for what they purchased. There was a doctor on site, and we did have a sundown town where they had to be back at Prince Crossing Farm before sun was down. It was declared illegal, and the housing was shut down in the 1980s, but the farm operated until 2005. Then when we look at that big spike in the overall immigration, that was really when you got these other two waves that are contributing. Families are learning about them. People are making enough money at Campbell's Soup Mushroom Farm to move into city proper, to move to nearby Wheaton, to move by nearby Carroll Stream. They're starting to expand as they feel more comfortable in the area. And so you get friends and family that start to travel up. And so in the 1970s, we get a large increase, just like the entire DuPage County gets, of many more immigrants coming from throughout Latin America. And we have larger families who are here who start contributing to the community in larger ways because they have numbers. And you always feel more comfortable going places when you have larger numbers. So the churches start to hold Spanish Mass, which is what we see a couple of the pictures here. And we start to get more business owners, more Latinx business owners. This is Rios Bridal from West Chicago, and she recently retired, but had been a downtown shop owner in the 1940s. And if you think about the 70s and 80s, that's also the time that economically in the United States, we're getting malls, many more malls. So mom and pop, traditional mom and pop Anglo-owned stores are being replaced by malls, but our immigrant population is feeding in and taking the store shops. So they're the ones opening businesses and keeping open many of the local downtowns, which we still actually see today. Here's some pictures of some of our early West Chicago businesses that were run by Mexican Americans. So restaurants, Dave's Latin American Grocery. And then this is a great picture of the Reyes's. And they were the first tortilla factory that was opened here in DuPage County in the 1950s. So economics, they're definitely contributing to economics. Culture, here are alebrijes here at Cantini Park, the contributions that we're making for our culture. Up on the upper left, you see our piñata, our 13-foot piñata in downtown West Chicago. Mexican Independence Day has been celebrated in West Chicago since the 1960s. Many other communities as well. Aurora, Bolingbrook now has a large Mexican Independence Day, and of course in Chicago, but that's also where we see some of that spill out as well. Many local area schools have ballet folklóricos, especially with the churches, and mariachi programs, which is a great way to not only allow our students, remember that high population of Latinx students, to find avenues where they also can express their own culture, so that they can be proud of that, even if they don't participate. To see their culture represented in an institution is something that's very important. And another reason why bringing the LatinX here to Cantini Park was so important, because when you see your culture reflected in something that doesn't usually reflect you, it allows you to feel more welcomed and part of the community. And then we also have leadership contributions. So you may remember this picture of the soldier that I had shown before. This is Joe Bonastro, who came and lived in a boxcar camp. He was one of the 2-year-olds in that first picture. He grew up, he went to fight in World War II. When he came home, and obviously was Spanish, English bilingual, the police department went to him and said, hey, we have all of these Mexican people coming to West Chicago and we have no one on the force who speaks Spanish. Will you come and be a translator for us? And of course he did it. He was home from war and needed a job. So he became a translator and then joined the force and then worked his way up and became police chief in the 1960s. And we think he is the first Mexican-American police chief in the state of Illinois, which is pretty impressive. And if you think about those days of there's still a lot of racism, there's still a lot of discrimination, but when your police chief is a Mexican immigrant, what does that say and what bridges does that allow us to create when it's somebody who's so respected? And Joe was best of the best, would stop on the street and talk to everybody. Once you know somebody like that who holds a position of authority, it helps everybody feel more comfortable talking to somebody. When you don't know them and they're not of your culture, you start to create bridges. Today, we also have State Senator Karina Villa, who's an amazing role model for us. And then in West Chicago, Mayor Ruben Pineda, who is our first Mexican-American mayor, and actually is our first Mexican-American alderman. In our large town that's majority Mexican-American, we have only had one Mexican-American alderman, and he became our mayor. So it also looks at issues of representation. And then leadership and organization, just like those of us at the Mexican Cultural Center, when our founder, Fernando Ramirez, founded our center, it was really because he felt that it was time for us to step forward versus always complaining about what we weren't seeing representing us. Well, it was time for us to lead the way and to propose things like the LatinX. And then Immigrant Solidarity DuPage, Casa Michoacan, other groups here in the suburbs who are trying to raise awareness about some of these issues. So when we think about that huge historical context of over 100+ years, what impacts does that have on us in the suburbs today? So many of us live in multicultural communities. We know that whether we operate within all of those aspects of it or not, we can go to a grocery store and never have to speak English. Sometimes we can go to other businesses and not have to speak English. Bilingual communities that allow for people to come here and to not feel like they can't operate in their community systems. And then we do also have continued migration. So if you think about those earliest immigrants that arrived here, the schools had to mobilize. They had to set up social services for them. And that's allowed other groups like World Relief, who very often settles people from the Middle East in West Chicago, because we have the systems in place to support immigrant populations. So that allows us to continue to take in refugees, other people who decide to come here to the United States. Again, those welcoming communities throughout DuPage County that attract then other immigrant groups. But there's also a lot of needs that come from some of the issues within systemic racism. So we do still have discrimination. In many places, we do still have divided communities where we don't always see eye to eye because we don't know this long history. We don't understand. In our brains, sometimes we always don't think, why would somebody leave their home and come here when they don't have the correct paperwork? But we don't think through, if somebody's doing that and risking their life walking through the desert, there must be a darn good reason. There's a great documentary that I would recommend anyone to look up. It's called Dying to Get In. And it tells that story of the desperation of people who are fleeing terrible, terrible problems. Remember that list we saw of the environmental conflicts that are happening throughout Latin America? There's a lot going on down there, and some of those resource fights we benefit from here in the Western world. And we also have to think that through. There's also a lot of lack of representation. Although I talked about those 2 representatives that we have, we've only had one Mexican-American alderman in a town that's over 50% Mexican-American. How do we make space for more representation? And then environmental racism, which we do see where when immigrant groups move in, they get stuck right next to the train tracks in town. They get stuck in places that are near Superfund sites. How are we also being aware of that? And then crisis management. How do immigrant and especially our Latinx population deal when we have huge political pressures? In some of the Western suburbs school districts, the day after President Trump was elected, we saw upwards of 40% absentee rates because parents were scared to take their kids to school. That is a reality. And we have to realize that what the ICE scares do to just attendance at schools, which is hard for some of us to think through. And then COVID, when people were able to stay home and work from home, usually it was the Latinx population or African-American population, other communities of color that didn't have that benefit, that had to go to work and got sick and got often very sick and sometimes unfortunately died. How do we rectify these issues when the systemic racism has led to so many disparities? We also look at headlines like this: representation, yay, we're getting a majority Latinx congressional seat. Ooh, at the same time that some of our institutions are selling data to ICE to go and take people who are undocumented. And also, again, our suburban numbers are going up, but it's also still very segregated. How are we addressing that in community development, and how are cities looking at ways to combat that? And then mental health. Generational trauma is something that's getting a lot more attention today, thank goodness, but we aren't doing nearly enough in our schools where social workers can't handle the influx, where people try to get to a counselor and they have to wait 6 months before they can get one, and when public aid doesn't always cover those services. So there's a lot of other issues that we have to address that are ripple down effects from the history. I'm going to stop there and hand it over to Elizabeth.
So you mentioned one of the earliest families was a native family. Is that Americans like ancestors?
It is, yep. They were farm workers that came in the 1950s. And in the museum, we have a whole bunch of information about those families.
I don't think Elizabeth has rejoined us yet. So while we wait for Elizabeth, great question. Why don't we field some questions for Sara based off of some of the things she talked to us about. So if there's anyone in our virtual audience who has a question, please feel free to just chuck that down in the Q&A. And of course, if anyone here, please feel free to raise your hand. We're happy to take any questions. Yes.
Why is it?
So I'll repeat the question for those of you on Zoom. So why do we see some of the environmental racism, especially when people move where they get located? So a lot of it does relate to cost of living. So if they have limited means, they're also sometimes shown very specific areas. And some of it's just outright racism for what's available. So if you go to a realtor or you don't even know how to do that, you know, how to function, I think that's one of the misconceptions that sometimes, unfortunately, we in the United States read as somebody who's uneducated. Well, I don't understand. How do they not know to go to a realtor's office? Or how do they not know to go into City Hall and find out about these things? Well, if there are no systems set up like that in your home country, you are not going to understand any of that. In West Chicago, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Kerr-McGee Thorium, huge Superfund site that we have. Somebody moving from another country had no idea to ask those questions. You would never imagine that somebody would sell you a house that hadn't been cleaned up from something that could cause cancer. But we see environmental racism in that way all over. I know that Cantini is going to be holding a wonderful speaker in a few days who's going to talk about in the Quad Cities, where there was a large group of Mexican Americans who served in World War II and got a lot of attention. That neighborhood is very close to railroad tracks. And it's because no one else wants to live there. And so, you know, it's this unfortunate environmental racism where then that's where immigrants end up because they don't know any better or they're not going to raise any issues. And I think some of that comes from that fear of when you don't know the systems to work within, and when you're afraid of issues of ICE and immigration, you're not going to balk because you're just happy to have the authorities leave you alone, which is unfortunately something that very often happens.
I see we have a couple of online questions, so let's just take one of those. Do you have current population stats for Central, King County, the Tri-City area, St. Charles, Batavia, Geneva?
I do not have that off the top of my head, but I know that there's similar growth in those areas. There's a Chicagolandia LatinX. I'm messing it up. I will post it later. I'll share it with Chris so he can look. There's a group from Elgin Community College that's been doing amazing interviews with Latinx population, especially focusing on the river communities there, and they've got great data from them.
There's a question over there in the black hat.
The Depression period, and then that was a moment where many Mexicans were deported.
Yeah.
Did you see or do you have data around if that occurred or if they were impacted, the individuals here in West Chicago?
Yeah, that's a great question. So she asked about when we see the Depression period, and a lot of people were deported during that period. Did we see that locally? We did a little bit. We see it not as much because they were living in the boxcar camps and working on the railroad. And in that time in West Chicago, 40% of the Anglo population was also working for the railroad, and those were rather stable jobs. So in more of what we would call commuter communities, where people would have lost more high-paying jobs, there you see job displacement. In a blue-collar community like West Chicago, you often didn't have as hard of a hit from the Depression, because there wasn't much to hit. You didn't have the stock market investments, so we didn't see as much of it. But we did see quite a bit in the 1930s when the boxcar camps started to shut down. There was mass deportation back, and we did see that at that period.
Let's grab one more from online. I understand that undocumented workers have been abused by temp agencies because they don't need to pay Social Security. Is that still a huge problem?
Yes and no. It's become less of a problem, but there's still a lot of distrust. And I don't know how many of you were familiar with the TIN system when the federal government said, well, undocumented people, they pay taxes. First of all, let's get that straight. They pay taxes. They just don't ever get to file a tax refund and get that money back. So they're paying more than their fair share. But people were very distrustful of going and getting a number. And so you do still have some of the exploitation. The catch-22 of that, it was a lot of those temp agencies got shut down because of all the regulations, but all that ended up doing in some areas was taking jobs away then, because then you had nobody who was able to provide an overarching institution for those job needs. So
I see that Elizabeth has joined us now. So thank you guys so much for those questions. Thank you again, Sarah, so much for helping get us started with today's presentation. Absolutely. I'm going to turn things over now to our second speaker this evening, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, I'm going to mute myself so that we don't get a giant reverb and I'll lose our eardrums here in person. And then the show is yours, your co-host. You should be able to share. So everybody, please welcome Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Chris, and hello, everyone. Good evening. So excited that I get to join you tonight virtually. And this is so cool that we have sort of the technology to be able to be in a space in a hybrid way. So anyway, my name's Elizabeth Cervantes, and I'm the co-founder of the Southwest Suburban Immigrant Project. We are a community-based organization and serve DuPage and Will counties in Illinois. And our work really consists of civic engagement, education, and advocacy for the immigrant community in our neighborhoods and our communities. And so I've been invited here tonight to share a little bit about what's going on immigration policy-wise in our nation and state today. And so I'm going to be screen sharing, and please let me know at any point, Chris or anyone else, if you're able to see my screen successfully. I hope that is working. Great. So immigration policy today. Really quickly, I thought that in order to do this and an effective way, we could focus on these three things. First of all, getting our history and our vocab in a shared way tonight, right? And so I'm going to be going over just some very brief, like the most recent history around immigration policy and change, and some of the vocabulary related to that. I also wanted to share what our current state of play is and what's sort of been going on. Where are we, and how possible is change? And then finally, close off with hopefully some opportunities for those of you who are interested to be able to get involved and help create some change. So I want to start off with this question, and of course, I might not be able to hear you, but just curious, right? If you know when the last pathway to citizenship was passed, and by pathway to citizenship, you know, I mean really an avenue for any person who immigrates to us to be able to have full citizen rights. And I'm going to let you think on that for a minute. You could either, I'm not there in person with you, but you could either say it to the person next to you or just take a guess. What year or when was the last pathway to citizenship passed? And I'm going to just give you like 2 seconds. So let's figure this out then. The last pathway to citizenship was created 35 years ago in 1986 via the Immigration Reform and Control Act. This was a bill that made it to President Reagan's desk at that time, where 2.7 million people were able to gain legal permanent residency. And so I want you to remember that for tonight. I want you to remember legal permanent residency or legal permanent residence, right? Which is also known often as LPR status. And so that is the very first step according to this nation's laws, to becoming a citizen with full rights. You first have to become a legal permanent resident. And so 2.7 million people under this law change were able to become LPRs and then eventually become citizens. The problem with this pathway that was created 35 years ago was that it also instituted criminalization of undocumented workers via programs like E-Verify, which you may be familiar with, and also the bars. The famous 3, 5, and 10-year bars, which unfortunately separate families and punish a person for being in the country in an undocumented way for over a year. And if you ever want to adjust your status, you have to leave the country and be subject to these bars. So it made these things in part of the institution of immigration laws in the country. So with that said, we have a few questions for you all, and I'm actually going to stop screen sharing really briefly here. And we have some poll questions. You might be able to see it if you're there in person, but I just want you to try your best for these first 3 questions to tell me what you think. So number 1, I just kind of want to test your knowledge a little bit. Anyone born in the US is a US citizen, even if their parents are undocumented, true or false? Then the other one is someone born outside of the US may be a US citizen. And number 3, if you have a child in the US, you cannot be deported. So we are looking at the answers as they're coming in. And if you haven't voted yet, go ahead and try. But largely, you are a very, very knowledgeable audience, because largely you are right? And anyone born in the US and is a US citizen, even if their parents are undocumented, and that is true. That is absolutely true. via our Constitution. And then someone born outside of the US, may be a US citizen, is also true, because you may, right, naturalize. And we'll talk about naturalization a little bit here. And then finally, if you have a child in the US, you cannot be deported. That is false. So correct. You are all right. You can still be, deported even if you have children who are US citizens. So we stop this poll and we go on to the next one. If you can help me out, Chris, because I have another set of 3 questions for you all. Let's see if you can ace this one. So number 1, a lawful permanent resident may be deported from the US. And remember, LPR, this is what I talked about earlier, right? Lawful permanent residency. True or false? Number 2, a person may be deported from the US without having a hearing before an immigration judge. True or false? And then finally, using false documents to work may expose you to criminal prosecution. True or false? And so we start with the first one. Yes, a legal permanent resident can be deported from the US, even after having that protected status, really a legal status. You can still lose that privilege. And number 2, the answer actually is true. A person can be deported from the US without seeing an immigration judge. That actually happens more than we think. And that is due to things such as expedited removal, which are processes, right, that we fight to change. And so there's also 100 miles within the border, from the border of any US border, really, there are certain rules that are different to the rest of the country in terms of immigration. And oftentimes things such as due process do not exist. So yes, this happens all the time. And then finally, using false documents to work may expose to criminal prosecution. That is true. So great work, everyone. And thank you so much for participating in the polls. I'm going to go back now and kind of end this poll into our presentation for tonight, so that we can unpack this a little more together. I'm going to close the poll here and share screen again. But let's get into the vocab a little bit. So who is undocumented? And, you may have sort of like your own sort of ideas or guesses around this, but it's simply a person who entered the US without inspection. Commonly people will say someone who entered without papers, but, really what truly took place is that this person entered the country without an actual inspection by an officer. It could also have been, though, someone who did enter with a legal inspection, like a visa, but that a visa expired and that person's status then became undocumented. An estimated 11 million undocumented people are living in the US, and approximately of those, 425,000 live in Illinois. There are there's more facts you can find via migrationpolicy.org in terms of immigration, the immigrant community and immigration policy. So just so that we're clear, right, this is who an undocumented person is, and really it could be literally anyone, right? Anyone could be undocumented from any country, from any age, and yeah, it's actually that simple. So how is it that simple, right? Why are there 11 million documented people in the country? And that's because it is extremely difficult to enter with a legal inspection, or quote unquote, how many might say, the right way. Because the right way is just actually a very, 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 very small right way. And either that or to adjust one's status once you're here in the country, the pathways are just very, very, very narrow. And so we're going to learn why those pathways and those why is it so hard, right, to maybe not have to overstay your visa and things like that. We have a lot of bodies that actually enforce immigration law. And just as a quick side note here, immigration law is actually the way that we have it today. It's not very old, right? It's actually, you notice 35 years ago was the latest kind of big immigration policy kind of change. But before that, most of our knowledge around immigration law is based in from 1965, actually. A lot of people may not know this, but with the Civil Rights Movement and the Civil Rights Act, right, there were also laws around immigration that really targeted a growing brown community in the U.S. and really kind of created immigration in the way that we know it today, which is by family-based and also employer-based. And so some of these limited categories that we know today are part of immigration law really are actually recent. It's just from 1965 forward that we have a lot of these laws in place. And so oftentimes we easy to think, right, that our immigration laws have been here since the founding of the country, which really is not the case at all. Immigration actually was far more relaxed and far more just, and we'll get to at the end, based on particular populations and groups and countries prior to 1965. And that is in order to sort of summarize it, although it's very complex, but just, so that we can kind of move along here, right? The Department of Homeland Security is also a very recent body that was created in 2003. And within that body, we have USCIS and ICE and CBP. These are, you might be familiar with CBP because these are the folks at the border who are, enforcing sort of that 100-mile radius set of rules, who are often the folks you see on the news that are dealing with recent arrivals or folks that are seeking asylum, for example, on our at the nation's borders. But we also have the often very terrifying for many in our community, agents of ICE. This is U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, who, as of more recently, especially in DuPage and Will County, lost a lawsuit actually for illegally targeting and raiding people in our communities. And so I'll get to it at the end, but Illinois is becoming, through advocacy and through policy, a really safe state when it comes to protecting the rights of immigrants. And finally, USCIS, which is, kind of that body that processes all sorts of applications for legal permanent residence, as well as naturalization and so forth. But then separate to DHS, we have DOJ. This is the Department of Justice. And through Department of Justice is how we have the EOIR and BIA. And these bodies are sort of like the ones who set these rules for how immigration laws are enacted and practiced and implemented. And so we won't get into a lot of that tonight, but I just wanted you to have these acronyms, right, and these bodies in your vocab. So how does one even become a citizen? So I think a lot of you might be already familiar with this because you did so well on the true and false poll questions. But number one, by land, right? You are born in the US within any of the 50 states and some territories as well that are part of the country, and that automatically grants you citizenship. But you can also be born outside of the US to a US citizen parent. And so by blood is the other way that you may become a US citizen. But you could potentially derive citizenship if any of your parents become a citizen while you are still a minor, while you are still under the age of 18. And so very, very like similar but different ways that you can become a citizen. And finally, the most often and common one for members of the documented then LPR community is naturalization, right? Which is when you're born outside of the US, but you become a legal permanent resident. And then after 5 years, then plus other requirements, which I'll get to in a minute, or 3 years if you're married to a US citizen, you can then petition to become a US citizen. So really quickly, those are the ways that you can become a US citizen. But here we go. Here's where the requirements come in, right? You not only have to be at least 18 years old, but again, like we said, other than your LPR status, your legal permanent residence, you have to meet a certain amount of time that you've spent out inside the US versus outside of the US. You also have to have show and prove that you don't have intention of abandoning your green card status. You have to read and speak and write basic English. There are some waivers, but only for people of certain ages and amounts of years that they've been on LPR. But other than that, you have to be knowledgeable about US civics. You have to take a meaningful oath to the US showing loyalty. You have to have evidence of good moral character. And you have to pay this fee of $725, which there is a waiver for sometimes depending on the family's income. So all of these are part of this process that often takes, a year and a half from when you started to be able to be completed. And so it does take some time for a lot of people. But the key that I want to leave you with, right, is that you cannot become a citizen unless you are first have become an LPR right here, right, the legal permanent resident. And that's where it gets tricky, right? There aren't many paths to becoming a legal permanent resident. This chart that you see here kind of shows, the percentages of people who pursue a path to LPR status based on what's available in immigration law. And you'll notice that the biggest one is family-based. So that means that you have a qualifying relative that is a US citizen or also maybe a legal permanent resident. But the priority for qualifying relatives does have a ranking. Spouses come first if you are married to someone who is a US citizen. But someone like maybe you have a sibling that is a US citizen, is kind of fourth in that category, in that ranking, in terms of a priority for becoming a legal permanent resident. You'll notice that about 16% of the paths, right, have been employment-based, so very small chunk, right? And these are like H-1B1 visas and so forth, right? But very, not easy to obtain. And then we get smaller and smaller as we go into refugees and asylees, diversity programs like the lottery, right? And other smaller categories. I'm not going to get into the smaller categories, right? But are things like U visas and VAWA and these other options for people to adjust their status once they're already in the country. But very difficult to get an LPR status. And like we learned earlier, or like you already all knew, I should say, having a green card does not mean ultimately that you have full citizen rights. You may you may be deported, and that could be for a variety of reasons. If you end up in some sort of civil or criminal dispute, it really can affect your green card status. So moving on here, these are the different communities of folks that don't have a current path to an LPR status. So even if they wanted to, right, become a US citizen and live and abide by the country's laws, it's pretty much impossible unless you have a qualifying relative or the other paths that we explored before to become an LPR. And that's tourists, students, temporary protected status, folks otherwise known as TPS, DACA beneficiaries, which is a deferred action for childhood arrivals, and just generally undocumented people at large. Also, if you have an employment visa, but you end up not being sponsored by your employer, you're also kind of in this limbo in its status. So, like I said, even with a qualifying relative, you may have to wait up to 20 plus years in order to even be granted the opportunity to a visa. Or if you're already in the country, you may be forced to leave as punishment. And so 3 or 5 or 10 years, sometimes there's even such a thing as a permanent bar from the country. And anyone can be subject to this depending on how they enter the country and depending on how long they've been in the country. But it all starts at 366 days. If you've been in the country 366 days, you know, as a person's undocumented, you know, it sort of triggers this punishment. So if you ever were to adjust your status, and I'm starting lightly here, right? Because tonight is not about an immigration law crash course, because there's no such thing. It's very complex, and so I want to just give really summarizing big points, kind of the big points of our immigration system today. But if you are interested, we do have other workshops. You can always reach out to my organization and we can get into a little bit more details and other presentations where we can continue talking about this topic. So what's the current state of play? So what's going on today, right? The only solution to fix this, right, is to change the law. As you note, as you are hopefully seeing through this, there are really no pathways for the 11 million undocumented people in the country, other than, you know, the very limited opportunities through a qualifying relative. And so removing the criminalizing bars and creating a new pathway to citizenship, because it's been 35 years, is really the only solution. There are many bills that have attempted that through the last couple decades, like the DREAM Act, which you may be familiar with, but they all have failed. We are at a point today where it's sort of at a standstill, in fact, when it comes to federal policy on immigration. And so even things like comprehensive immigration reform have failed. And I want to leave with you tonight sort of this important note on what used to be called CIR, or comprehensive immigration reform, and why it was so dangerous. And that's because these types of package bills almost always included anti-immigrant measures. They were used to negotiate, a bill and a law, but really ended up hurting people and breaking up families, rather than bringing justice to the whole history of immigration policy, right? And so we as a community-based organization that focuses on immigrant rights, right, we really believe it's important to make up and fix the wrongs that have been through history enacted through immigration policy, because it is, not for tonight's presentation, but there is another another presentation, right, that really goes into why immigration policy is really tied to race, right, and why it's important for us when we talk about justice and when we talk about really being a welcoming country, right, to immigrants, that we correct this. And so where do we go from here? And with this, I sort of end, but like I said, federal legislation right now is at a standstill, but DACA, as you should know, is making its way through the courts. DACA is not the DREAM Act, right? DACA is an executive program, right, that has been sort of been taking the ride of its life on a roller coaster in the last 10 years or so. Actually, 2022 is the 10th anniversary of DACA, and I actually am a DACA recipient myself, so I really know what that has felt like, right? But DACA is currently, has been sued left and right, and it's still standing, but it's still going to be, making its rounds through different courts. But so far in Illinois, we have done some really great things, right? We have ended immigrant detention centers. we have expanded healthcare for the immigrant community, especially those that are older immigrants, because if you don't have a pathway to citizenship in 35 years, you're going to have members of this immigrant undocumented community that are getting older, right, and are getting more vulnerable. And so that is something that is really important to community-based organizations and advocacy organizations. And so we have successfully expanded some type of healthcare in Illinois, a version of Medicaid for older immigrants who otherwise would not have access actually to primary care doctor and things like that. And then we're also, of course, paving the way for protections of the most vulnerable through the pandemic. And my organization, along with many others across the state, are really looking out for ways that we can be a strong and welcoming state. And so if you want to learn more about this, tonight was really just a quick summary that I wanted to share with you all. But if you want to learn more about our work or how you can get involved, right, there's our website, ssipchicago.org. You could also follow us on Facebook or Instagram, and you can just type in SSIP Chicago and we should come up right away. There's always something happening. There's always some sort of alert, especially if you are good about making a phone call or sending an email to your legislator, that really only takes 5 minutes. Then stay tuned on our pages, because sometimes we need that type of support. Sometimes we need to make sure our legislators are watching the different things that are moving through the courts and moving through the House and Senate in Washington, D.C., as well as in our General Assembly here in the state, and making sure that we are being a voice around protecting our immigrant community. So follow us on those pages, but leave you with some pictures of just my community being organized and being involved more recently, and really stepping out there and talking about how important it is, right, for after 35 years to bring some sort of solution to this community. And with that said, I greatly appreciate your time tonight, and I'm looking forward to any questions or any thoughts that I can help answer.
All right, cool. Good. I just didn't want to blast yours. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. We can't hear you right now as we pulled the speakers real fast, but thank you so much for such an informative presentation. I know I speak for everyone who's here with us live and virtually with a big virtual round of applause for you. Thank you so much. I do want to hit up, there are definitely some questions here. I'm going to start real fast if my in-person audience doesn't mind. I know we're at 8 o'clock, but I definitely want to give Elizabeth some time to answer some questions as well, if you're willing to stick around with us for a little while longer. If not, thank you again so much for joining us. But this one comes from online. Are government forms generally available in Spanish and in other indigenous languages in DuPage County, including applications for child care assistance? 1 second, Elizabeth, while I get the speakers back on for you. I'll give you the thumbs up.
Great. Yeah, this is a great question. Actually, it varies. So it really depends on the form that we're talking about. One thing that DuPage County has been really great about has been in translating based on the population in DuPage County, foreign-born population, I should say, and translating things like election materials and the ballot, and yes, definitely many forms around public benefits, for example. But other counties, have actually more recently changed this. So I know in Will County this year, for example, was the very first year ever that the ballot was available in both English and Spanish to a lot of our voters. And this was due to census data, right, that really made this possible, but it really does vary county by county, and of course, based on the population too. But we have some great resources in DuPage County and some great folks who are constantly working on catching what needs to be translated, but it's definitely always an ongoing effort, and always people who are stepping up and wanting to help interpret and or translate resources are always welcome to our organizations. I hope that answers the question.
Elizabeth, am I going to come out of that? Okay, good. Ooh, that was a close one. Elizabeth, one of our in-person audiences asked if there is a fee involved with becoming a U.S. citizen, and if so, what is it?
Yes, there most certainly is. It's $725. What the fee to USCIS involves. And there are some waivers that some people may apply for, but it really depends on their income. And so other than that, it's $725 plus legal fees. So it does add up, especially if maybe there are one or two members in a family, in a household that need to become, that need to start the naturalization process. It definitely could add up to the thousands.
I have a follow-up question to that, Elizabeth. Where does the number 725 come from? Do we know that? Like, did they just pull a number randomly out of the air? Is there a justification for why it costs so much money to just apply for that process, especially when those legal fees are going to make it exorbitantly more expensive?
I love that question. Yeah, absolutely. So it actually increased not long ago. It used to be $525, if I'm not mistaken, in the past, and in the last, I want to say 3 years, it went up to $725. And often, USCIS will publish an announcement that there's going to be a change in the fees, and they are supposed to have this sort of process by which they're open to commentary from the public and community-based organizations, but more often than not, that decision's already been made. And so it's a great question that I think it would be good to ask directly of USCIS, but oftentimes it really is based on their own internal data.
Back in the blue real fast.
So why isn't becoming a citizen via derivation more known by the public? Because I think a lot of children of U.S. naturalized citizens would qualify. And I think it's an underknown way to become a best citizen.
Can I ask you to come up here and repeat that? Because you said that so beautifully and eloquently that I'm not going to do it justice, and I want to make sure Elizabeth and our home audience hears it better. Thank you so much.
Sure. Hey, Elizabeth, great presentation, by the way. I'm one of the lead members in Roselle and Bloomingdale, but my question was about how come the path to citizenship via derivation is not as well known? I think there's a lot of children of U.S. naturalized citizens that would qualify for citizenship based on the rules as they're written, but it's not talked about a lot. It's not easy to find that information at USCIS. How come that isn't shared more publicly?
No, it's a great question. It's a very complex process and option. It's sort of the short answer. So there are a lot of things that need to line up in order for derivation to work. And so I'm going to try and make this super short, because otherwise we're going to be here all night. And in terms of getting into how derivation works, but there's multiple check boxes there. And so the person who's deriving citizenship has to be under 18. There's a lot of dates that end up being thrown in the mix. So when did the parent actually become a legal permanent resident or UN? And then there's also another thing called acquisition, which is very similar to derivation, but very different at the same time. And so these processes are complex. And so you need, an attorney to really review this case. What I will say is that organizations like mine that that meet this need through community workshops, through citizenship workshops, are able often to catch these cases. And that's because we have very thorough legal screening. I or my colleagues who are also DOJ accredited representatives, we are accredited through the Department of Justice to do these types of legal screenings, right? We'll ask a series of questions sometimes. And one thing we always want to know is, no matter how old you are, no matter if you're coming to us at 35 or 55, we always want to know, did any of your parents ever, in their lifetime become a US citizen? And if they did, when? And so we do a lot of that math, and sometimes, I have seen it many times myself, we're able to catch a potential case of derivation or acquisition. But then they're also very hard to, the paperwork, involved there to put it together and make that case to USCIS, is a lot of work. So very complex things. Short answer is, it is out there, we're catching it, but it is definitely not, as broadly known, for sure.
All right, so you guys mentioned earlier when we did the mic check, and Andrew and I were like, so we're getting really a little bit over the time, so I want to be respectful, of course, to Elizabeth and of course Sara. So why don't we wrap up with your 2 final questions? Please. Mm-hmm. Okay.
I mean, it was feasible, it must be minimal.
Of course. I see your hand, so I will come back to you real fast. You comment? Yes, please. Yes.
In Latin America, we are Latinos, Mexicans,
Mhm.
Colombian, or whatever our nationality is. Very much like Hispanic. Latinx is a generational term from the US. That just gender and all this stuff. Yeah.
So for our virtual audience, there was a great conversation that just happened here. And I don't know, Elizabeth, you're like, these guests were closer to the mic, so maybe you picked it up over in virtual land. But one of our guests here in the front had pointed out that they had never actually really heard of the term Latinx until more recently when they had immigrated into the country. That was not a term. And a comment from the back was that is a more, and it definitely is a more modern, generational, and a United States of America term. And that's more our younger generations with the concept of gender and how in Spanish-speaking languages, the Latino versus Latina and making it more neutral, that's definitely a more modern situation. And then to the fee, I was like, I can't remember where the point was. And she had followed up with the point that when she had immigrated in the 80s, you had said yes, that there wasn't a fee. And if it was, it must have been a very minimal fee. Would the fee have been more minimal back then?
Absolutely, yes. The fee for petitioning or starting your naturalization process has absolutely progressively increased over the years. At some point, I believe it was only $50, and that is actually in very recent history. So it absolutely has gotten more costly as the years go by, and it is almost also expected that it's going to go up again. In fact, there had been a recent push to increase the fee one more time, and we were able to delay that. But yes, that is just sort of the trend of things.
Cool. You guys are asking good questions. I had a guest ask, what is the reason to increase the fee? What are they giving?
Well, that's definitely a fun question because like I said, there's typically this by which USCIS determines their fees, and most of the time it's internal data, right? That they are focusing on in order to see, well, how much does it cost, for this to for the work that goes into this sort of casework, right? But there is a process by which whenever there's going to be a change of that nature, they have to be open to public commentary. And in my experience, at least in the years that I've done this work, that public commentary only helps delay the new decision or the change a little bit, because they are obligated to respond to each of those public comments. Things like maybe like public charge, if folks here in tonight's audience are familiar with things like public charge, you know, we've been able to delay public charge many times just via public commentary. They are obligated to respond to each person who submits a public comment onto proposed rule changes. And so I think that there's really no clear answer as to why, and there's really no real law or rule that they can't, right? So really, like, there isn't, it's really that, right? So I don't have the greatest answer tonight, but the truth is, right, is that they can and they do increase the cost, right? And they could cite really anything for that being the reason. But I'm with you all on the same page, and that it often is very difficult, and some people have to wait 20, 25 years to start their process to become a citizen and have full rights because of that cost.
Well, again, I would like to thank everyone here. Again, big thank you to Elizabeth and Sara. And I'm going to invite Judy back up to just close us out and let you guys know about what's coming next with the League of Women Voters.
So again, thank you to Sara and Elizabeth. We really appreciate your being here and sharing such valuable information. And thank you for sharing your evening with us. And thanks to the audience, both online and virtual. We really appreciate you being here. And participating, as a matter of fact. And also, we want to give a big thank you to Cantini, our partner. What a lovely place to host our events. So we thank you. And yeah. And also thank you to our sister leagues, Glen Ellen, Roselle Bloomingdale, and Central Kane County. And then the League of Women Voters, just to give you a quick overview, is our mission is to defend democracy and empower voters through voter registration and education. The League is strictly nonpartisan, a political organization though, and that we never support or oppose any political party or candidate. And we are committed to providing fact-based information and open discussion forums to help voters make their own decisions. And we will be hosting a candidate forum here at Cantini on October 23rd. So please check our website. It'll be a great event. And then please join us next month in September on the 8th at 7 p.m. for our civic awareness program. It's preventing violence, and it's going to be a panel discussion. And our panel will include Karina Villa, a former school social worker and leading advocate for mental health services, and also Maura Hirschauer, founder of Moms Demand Action in Fox Valley, and then Phil Andrew, co-founder of PAX Group LLC, whose mission is to build cultures of safety in communities. We're looking forward to seeing you next month. Drive home safely, and thank you very much. Good night.